Call me crazy, but I'm cautiously optimistic about Spider-Noir.
You crazy?
When it was first announced in early 2023 that Sony and Amazon were teaming up for a live-action Spider-Man Noir show with Nicolas Cage reprising his role from the Spider-Verse film, the consensus online and within myself was, okay. And sure, I get it. We're oversaturated with superhero media, and Sony's track record of Spider-Man spin-off projects is, it's hardly spotless. It's actually pretty bad. A live-action Spider-Man TV show made by Sony and Amazon that's a 1930s crime noir drama could be awesome. Could be, but it's also so out of left field, so random. But the more I've seen and heard from Spider-Noir, the more my skepticism has turned into genuine intrigue, because like, whether this thing's good or bad, I just want to see what it's going to be. And after seeing the first trailer, I'm actually convinced the show could be something special. The show is the brainchild of executive producers Phil Lord and Chris Miller, as well as showrunners Oren Uziel and Steve Lightfoot, who also had a hand in Punisher, and longtime Spider-Man producer, of course, Amy Pascal. The Spider-Verse movies are some of the best superhero films ever, period, and the involvement of excellent storytellers like Lord and Miller should spark some excitement. The concept of making a 1930s Chinatown-style Spider-Man show is such a smart and fresh idea, and the trailer seems like the right blend of Maltese Falcon meets Dick Tracy, while still managing to somehow feel like Spider-Man. And in a world where superhero movies and shows are becoming increasingly homogenous, studio-driven, and just very repetitive, something wacky and different like Spider-Noir could be exactly what we need. So, if you're willing to hear me out, allow me to explain why exactly I'm so intrigued by Spider-Noir, how the project seems to be taking a fresh and bold new approach to comic book adaptations, and what its existence might mean for the future of superheroes on the small screen. Like most people, my first introduction to Spider-Noir came in 2018 when the character appeared in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. The film was a huge, and that is kind of an understatement at this point, breath of fresh air, one of the most creative takes on bringing the world of comics to life, and a perfect love letter to the endless possibilities of who and what Spider-Man is, and what the hero means to so many people. In a movie dominated by memorable characters and fun new takes on the wall crawler, it was Nicolas Cage's Humphrey Bogart-esque noir that became an unexpected favorite. I mean, he was certainly one of my favorites walking out of that film. It was just a handful of scenes, but Cage fully lent into the aesthetics of a hard-boiled 1930s detective version of Spider-Man, perfectly walking the tightrope between earnestness and camp, and became one of the most memorable characters in the whole movie. And given this success and the A-list actor involved, who also happens to be a huge comic book fan, mind you, it shouldn't be a shock that this is the character Lord and Miller chose to spin off into his own series. Yeah, it's been reported that we're getting Spider-Punk and Spider-Gwen as well, but it makes sense that this is the first one out the gate, and that they're not doing it in animation. I think that really speaks volumes about the ideas that they were so excited about with this particular project. Following the success of the first Spider-Verse film, Lord and Miller signed a deal with Sony Pictures Television to develop multiple shows for the studio, including their various Spider-Man-centric properties. A year later, Deadline reported Sony was in negotiations with Prime Video for the streaming service to become home to Sony's Marvel-based television shows. While the initial rumors were that characters like Silk could be brought to the small screen, or that they were going to do like a Silver Sable kind of thing, Sony unveiled Spider-Noir in early 2023, with Lord and Miller noting the clear potential in a standalone series following the character's breakout role in Into the Spider-Verse. It's interesting to note, with that said, that the character of Spider-Man Noir was still a relatively new creation in the comics when he was adapted into the Spider-Verse films. Created in 2009, the original Spider-Man Noir comics followed a variant of Peter Parker in an alternate 1930s-esque universe where many of Marvel's biggest heroes were reimagined as throwbacks to the pulp and film noir genres that dominated that era and helped inspire the creation of superheroes as a whole. The version of the web-slinger also bears many similarities to the Spider, a pulp hero created in 1933 by Harry Steger, and the show's version adopts the same name as an homage to both this character and other contemporary heroes like the Shadow and the Spirit. In the original comic, Spider-Man's origin is changed so that Uncle Ben and Aunt May were activists during the Great Depression, and Ben was killed by a crime lord, Norman Osborn, to cover up his actions. As an adult, Peter and journalist Ben Urich investigate his uncle's death, leading to Peter intercepting a shipment of antiques from the Goblin Gang, where he's swarmed by a cluster of spiders. Coming face to face with the Spider God, Peter is reborn and granted superhuman powers, becoming the god's manifestation to fight against evil and injustice. This origin marks a very clear departure from Peter's classic coming-of-age story, and the show seems to be taking a similar approach, albeit with different characters and a more grounded body horror-inspired focus. We know from casting news that Brendan Gleeson's Silvermane is likely the show's main antagonist, depicted as a crime lord that the Spider encounters while investigating a series of high-profile assassinations. As the hero descends into the tangled web of New York's criminal underground, he encounters foes like Flint Marko, aka the Sandman, played by Jack Houston, and what seems like Molten Man, played by Lucas Haas, alongside allies like Lee Jun Lee's Kat Hardy and Lamorne Morris's Robbie Robertson. Perhaps the biggest change, though, is that Spider-Noir isn't a show about Peter Parker. Although the original comics and the Spider-Verse films feature Peter under the monochromatic costume, the show will instead be the live-action debut of the infamous Ben Reilly. For anyone even casually familiar with Spider-Man lore, Ben Reilly is a name that holds a lot of weight. I remember when I was playing the Spider-Man PS1 game back in the day, that was my first introduction to Ben Reilly, because I'd always pick the Scarlet Spider costume because it just looked cool as fuck. And you know what? It still does look cool as fuck. And that's kind of the thing with Ben Reilly. He's just the face guy, right? He's part of Face Squad. He's just this cool looking dude, looks like a badass, he's got a great costume, and that's really all there is to him. He's not the most interesting individual, but that's, I guess, kind of par for the course for a lot of 90s comic characters like that. In the early 1970s, after the death of Gwen Stacy, Marvel told a one-issue story in which Spider-Man encounters a villain named the Jackal, who created clones of himself and the recently deceased Gwen Stacy. Spidey fights the evil doppelganger, and the comic ends with the clone seemingly dying. Flash forward to the mid-1990s, and Marvel unveiled The Clone Saga. This 2-year-long event reintroduced the clone as Ben Reilly, having survived his apparent death and adopted a new identity based on his late Uncle Ben and Aunt May's maiden name. After returning to confront Peter, dyeing his hair blonde and adopting the Scarlet Spider persona, as I mentioned before, Ben quickly became a fan-favorite character, and even briefly took over from Peter as Marvel's main Spider-Man. Even after the Green Goblin killed Ben Reilly at the end of the Clone Saga, the character remained a huge part of the Spider-Man mythos. His story is one defined by tragedy, a person blessed with great power and responsibility, but unable to find his place in the world, always feeling like an outsider and stuck in the shadow of the real Peter Parker. He's a fascinating character. The writing wasn't the best for him. Again, there are these interesting ideas that are, at the core of who Ben Reilly is, but they did a lot of weird shit. They did a lot of, the Clone Saga is a fucking nightmare, anyways. Needless to say, though, I think he's a character that fans have been curious to see how they would adapt, or if they would ever adapt him, for years by this point. And although he did appear in 2023's Across the Spider-Verse, voiced by Andy Samberg, and portrayed more akin to his original 90s depictions, the creators of Spider-Noir decided to make their protagonist a version of Ben instead of Peter, and I find that brilliant. Now, I should say, this isn't me saying I expect Spider-Noir to secretly be a show about clones or even dive into that aspect of Ben's backstory, but it does suggest that Cage's Spider-Man might be a more tortured and world-weary version than we're used to. In the trailer, we get glimpses of Ben's origin, suggesting he may have been a soldier during World War I that underwent some sort of monstrous experiment or transformation that gave him his powers. There's a shot that suggests maybe Ben's undergoing a blood transfusion, and we even see him glance ominously at a spider that happens to be in the jar. If so, this would be a departure from the original Spider-Man Noir backstory, but would actually play into Ben Reilly's lore in an interesting way, keeping the idea of him being the product of a mad scientist forced to struggle with his place in the world, while also linking him directly to the show's time period setting and other contemporary pulp heroes with similar origins. Ben's origin as some sort of experiment not only remains true to the character's creation in the comics, but also establishes a theme of existentialism that appears to be driving his arc throughout the series. By taking Reilly's origin and reframing it as a veteran returning from the war, completely unable to readjust to civilian life, it casts both his actions as the Spider and his work as a private investigator in a much more complex light. He's unable to find a coping mechanism that will help him locate his place in the world, and as such, he turns to violence, self-destruction, and vengeance until it likely consumes him. Maybe there's some sort of inherent tragedy here, too. Perhaps while Ben was fighting overseas and being turned into the Spider, he lost someone close to him, a Gwen Stacy, an Uncle Ben, or an Aunt May. And this loss, combined with his experiences in the war, manifests in the intense rage simmering beneath the surface that fuels his vigilante crusade. Honestly, the more I think about it, the arc feels more reminiscent of Daredevil in the comics of Frank Miller than any other cinematic Spider-Man. This is even reflected in the show's tagline: with no power comes no responsibility. Obviously, this is a playful subversion of Peter's classic mantra, but it also potentially speaks to Ben's tortured psyche, too. From what we've seen so far, he's a much more cynical protagonist than any previous version of Peter, a man trapped in a vicious cycle and feeling like he has no power or agency to save himself or the world around him. This tracks with Lord and Miller referencing 1974's Chinatown as a big influence on Ben's character, telling Esquire that Reilly already has his Chinatown disillusionment moment years before the show begins. So, when we first meet Ben and he believes that he has no power to change things, then he has no responsibility for what happens, resulting in self-destructive behavior, alcoholism, and crime fighting in a much more reckless way. Or maybe in his PI work, only taking cases or following trails that benefit him on a selfish level. Beneath all that, though, Ben Reilly is still Spider-Man and has a desire to help people, even if he doesn't think it'll make much of a difference, and he has to reconcile that desire with how he feels now, knowing everything he knows. Whatever that may be. Your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea. Maybe it's the fact that the government is experimenting on people, or it's this private company in cahoots with the government that's experimenting on people, a project that he was a part of. And I think that clear attempt to differentiate Spider-Noir from his live-action contemporaries, Tom Holland, Andrew Garfield, and Tobey Maguire, is also reflected in the decision to replace Peter Parker with Ben Reilly. Peter would feel out of place in this hard-boiled detective setting, but Ben, a character defined by his emotional baggage and moral complexity, feels tailor-made for this type of story. In that same interview with Esquire, co-showrunner Oren Uziel explained that by making him Ben Reilly, it distances the character from the audience's expectations of Peter Parker, allowing them to craft a wholly new take on Spider-Man that feels tailor-made for this grim crime noir setting. Instead of Spider-Man's story being a coming-of-age tale, Spider-Noir appears to be a more midlife crisis, with Ben being depicted as someone struggling to escape his past and find a place in this increasingly grim and gritty world. Similarly, Chris Miller described the character as older and jaded and not afraid to punch a guy in the face drunkenly. This not only shows how Ben is wildly different from Peter, but also speaks to the inner turmoil this character seems to be experiencing. Given what we know about his origin and comic book background, it's plausible when we meet Ben Reilly, he's a broken man afflicted by vice, using his vigilante crusade as the Spider to numb his inner pain, much in the same way he would with alcohol. There's also a quote Nicolas Cage said in that same Esquire interview that really stuck with me. He explained that he wanted to play the character as a spider trying to cosplay a man. While this could be taken literally, I mean, there's a lot of weird, trippy spider body horror on display in the trailer, at least that, that one shot that everyone's talking about. I think that's a clear metaphor for someone uncomfortable in their own skin and having an identity crisis, with the spider persona and the trauma linked to it being both a gift and a curse throughout Ben's life. So you can kind of see how the typical Spider-Man dilemma manifests itself, just in a way we haven't experienced before, and I think in a way that so many of us have wanted to see experienced before. Adult problems and adult drama. This is an adult man who is going through a crisis being Spider-Man. But outside of that, that concept feels very reminiscent of classic pulp icons like the Spirit, someone who died and was reborn as a hero, now struggling with the responsibility of his destiny and how to affect change in a disillusioned world. All of this suggests, and really the showrunners have basically said as much, that Reilly is someone in the midst of an existential crisis, unable to recognize himself, and thereby finds comfort in the mask and his costumed alter ego to escape his troubled past. If anything, this new take on Ben Reilly might fit the character better than his 90s origins did, given he was killed off quickly and never quite found his place in the Marvel Universe after the Clone Saga. By placing him in the gritty world of 1930s New York and in the shadow of both world wars, it maintains the grim, tortured aesthetic that defined 90s comics and the Scarlet Spider specifically, and applies it to a genre where that kind of thing is expected. As strange as it might have seemed when it was first announced, the decision to have Cage play Ben Reilly might be an inspired creative decision and breathe new life into a beloved character that's often struggled to find his own identity next to Peter. With that said, I should also probably point out that Sony Pictures does have certain restrictions on what a live-action Spider-Man can and can't do, specifically pertaining to Peter Parker. A leaked 2015 email. Remember those Sony leaks, guys? They're the gift that keeps on giving. Anyways, it stipulated that Peter couldn't smoke, take drugs or alcohol, use foul language beyond PG-13, or kill, either in self-defense or outright. Given the fact that the show is clearly showcasing all of that in full display, I mean, there's a promotional image of Nicolas Cage drinking and smoking at a bar, so they're just throwing that out the window. They're clearly aiming for a darker, more adult tone than a traditional Spider-Man project, and it makes sense for the producers to circumvent these restrictions by using Ben Reilly, a character defined by crisis and turmoil, who would better fit this more morally ambiguous world. I mean, that's kind of what happened in the comics, right? Like, Ben Reilly allowed Spider-Man to be this edgier version of the character, this dark, brooding, that was like the thing in 90s comics, right? Like, it was just everyone was this angsty, dark version. And I think in hindsight, it comes across as a bit try-hard. Like, 90s comics weren't the greatest era for stuff like this. But when you strip it of all the stuff that hasn't really aged that well, I think just boiled down to his core, Ben Reilly fits better as a noir protagonist. So all of this just lends to the fact that, like, yeah, obviously, Ben Reilly should be your out if you want to get around all of these things. You have a built-in piece of lore that you can use in an interesting way. And let me be clear, I don't think we should expect Spider-Noir to be dour. If Nick Cage is known for anything, it's balancing intensity with moments of absurd comedy and sheer wackiness that no one could ever really conceive of, but only Nick Cage can. Referencing back to that big Esquire interview, the actor described his performance as 70% Humphrey Bogart and 30% Bugs Bunny, which is an absolute insane sentence to just say out loud, but it's also a great indicator of the show's tone and overall style, balancing pulpy detective drama with comic book camp and silliness. And if you take that and you pair it with this whole idea of a spider trying to cosplay as a human, I don't think there's a more unhinged description, and I kind of love all of that. Will it be intense and serious and probably melodramatic? Yeah, but I also don't think it's gonna take itself so seriously. I mean, the characters are gonna take themselves seriously, but I think the show is gonna recognize how to balance the humor of what's happening on screen with serious, intense moments, which is like kind of a Lord and Miller hallmark at this point. And that's also the thing that 90s comics, especially the Clone Saga, the Scarlet Spider stuff, were really good at. They took themselves too seriously, and then it kind of circled back around to being cringe. And so I think this whole approach that Lord and Miller are after with Spider-Noir is going to be a great way to adapt certain elements of that without it feeling, I don't know, just embarrassing? That's the word that comes to mind. Yeah, the Clone Saga is embarrassing. Oh god. In all serious though, the change from Peter to Ben and what this probably means for the show's overall tone and direction is a big part of my curiosity towards it. Even though I love Spider-Man and each iteration we've seen of him on screen, Spider-Noir has the potential to put a truly fresh and unique spin on the hero. Although Spidey has had more great films than basically any other comic book character outside of maybe Batman, it oftentimes feels like Marvel is hesitant to take risks and, for lack of better words, creative swings with him. Speaking of creative swings, you see those fucking swinging sequences? My god, this is what we've been missing from the Watts films for so long. Like, Lord and Miller continue to eat live-action Spider-Man's lunch. Like, no shade to John Watts, no shade to Destin Daniel Cretton. I haven't seen a lick of footage of what he's gonna do. I'm sure it's gonna be great, but like, just the fact that this is like a TV show and it already looks better than most swinging sequences in any of the Tom Holland Spider-Man, like, kind of crazy. I mean, they even managed to sell it with him wearing a fucking fedora. You gotta be kidding. Like, oh, this is great. Through reboot after reboot, we always seem to end up telling similar stories with Peter Parker at the same points in his life: high school, college, and the period between teenage angst and young adulthood. This isn't a problem itself. Spider-Man has been a coming-of-age story since the days of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, but it does sometimes make the character feel stuck in a state of arrested development, never allowing to move beyond the age age of, say, 25 and into other periods of his life that might be an interesting place to tell stories. I've talked about that a lot ad nauseum. I have a whole video talking about why Peter Parker is broken. You should definitely go check that out if you want more of my thoughts on this whole idea of Peter Parker in Arrested Development. This isn't just a cinematic problem, though. Spider-Man comics have struggled with this problem too, following 2007's One More Day, with a vocal subsection of readers still clamoring for the married and more mature take on Peter that dominated comics of the 90s and early 2000s. I think this underlying frustration with how Marvel has rigorously maintained Spider-Man's status quo is partly why films like Into and Across the Spider-Verse were so successful. As well as being great movies, they're a celebration of every aspect of the Spider-Man lore and how the character can and has taken many different forms since his creation. Whether it's Miles Morales, Spider-Man 2099, Spider-Noir, or Peter B. Parker, Spider-Man can be so much more than what Marvel has oftentimes allowed him to be. And more so than anyone else, Phil Lord and Chris Miller seem to understand that and want to push those boundaries to their limits. And given that Spider-Noir is seemingly introducing an older, more grizzled take on Spider-Man, being played by a 62-year-old Nicolas Cage, it looks pretty good for 62, gotta say. It could tap into the same qualities that have made recent comics like Jonathan Hickman's Ultimate Spider-Man, which introduces a 35-year-old Peter with a wife and 2 children who becomes Spider-Man while battling a midlife crisis, so well received by die-hard fans. Combining this appetite for stories exploring a midlife Spidey with the themes of existentialism, personal turmoil, and identity sets Spider-Noir up as a fascinating examination of adolescence and young adulthood alongside his heroics. But this more grizzled, trauma-laced Ben Reilly, who's had to suppress his powers for so long that it started to eat away at him, feels like a fresh take on a character who's seemingly been interpreted in every possible way and incorporates the trademarks of classic film noir while still also feeling like quintessential Spider-Man. Honestly, that's not an easy tightrope to juggle, and it's kind of a miracle we're at this point, but if anyone is going to understand what makes a great Spider-Man story, it's Phil Lord and Chris Miller. They seem to have a real passion for the character and a deep understanding and reverence for every corner of the hero's lore, and also aren't afraid to ditch the kid gloves and really play with the character in interesting ways. Lord and Miller are just some of the most exciting filmmakers and producers working today, whether it's the Jump Street films, the Lego Movie, Spider-Verse, or the highly anticipated Project Hail Mary. They've established themselves as fresh voices in an often stale studio system that isn't afraid to take risks and shake up massive IPs. I mean, they made an emotionally gripping movie about Lego, for God's sake. Like, if you do that and you succeed at that, anything is kind of possible. Their work in producing the Spider-Verse films shows how they're not afraid to play with the lore and bend and break these properties. The entire thesis of 2023's Across the Spider-Verse is literally Miles fighting against canon events and the rigidity of status quo in order to forge his own destiny and freedom while still being a more than worthy Spider-Man. He's not going to let things that have defined previous Spider-Men define him. He's gonna find his own way to the mask. It's in this context that a show like Spider-Noir makes perfect sense. Into the Spider-Verse highlighted how you can take bold swings with the character, and as long as it's well written and faithful to the core of who Spider-Man is, audiences will embrace new takes on the hero, and how Nick Cage's Spider-Noir became a cult favorite after the film's release demonstrates that. Despite being a vastly different take on Spider-Man, he resonated with audiences, with the added bonus of a decorated movie star like Cage voicing him and going all in with the performance. The fact that Lord and Miller have so much cachet that they're able to hold Sony hostage is brilliant at this point. I think it's forcing Sony to make creative decisions that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise. And the fact that that then forced them to develop a standalone show with Nicolas Cage as Spider-Noir speaks to the filmmakers' unwavering dedication to using these franchises to tell fresh, unique, and interesting stories, and the studio's surprising willingness to take risks with such a lucrative and important property. For all their faults, and dear God, there are many, Sony Pictures hasn't been afraid to take risks with the Spider-Man film rights. Now, I'm not about to start defending the likes of Morbius, Madam Web, and Craven. I'll defend Venom, but that's about it. But they have shown a willingness to gamble on their IPs and greenlight more obscure and out of left field projects, elevating relatively obscure characters from Spider-Man's catalog and giving them their own standalone films. The problem with a lot of these examples is that Sony failed to hire visionary filmmakers to bring these stories to life, and really it wound up feeling like massive cash grabs. They didn't really care about what they were doing. Because it's one thing to say, hey, let's make a Kraven movie, but it's another to find the right storytellers with the vision to make it work, tapping into what makes the character work on the printed page and translating it to the screen. And I'm talking about Kraven because I actually think a Kraven movie could have worked, just not the way that they decided to make it. Oh my god. Sure, Sony's cinematic Spider-Man universe was a catastrophe, but there is something to appreciate about the studio's willingness to make films based on lesser-known characters and be more daring with their IPs than their fellow studios. I honestly think the fact that they are more constrained in what they can use, that the toys are limited, is what forces them to do these kinds of things. While they kind of stumbled out the gate with their, what is it, Spamunk, or whatever the Sony Spider-Man movie universe, I don't even remember what it is. It's clear that they're learning from those lessons and pivoting to what's working, which is the Spider-Verse stuff and Lord and Miller. I mean, after all, it's the creative latitude they've afforded Lord and Miller that led to the Spider-Verse films, and the studio clearly trusts them because of that, so giving them this freedom to bring something like Spider-Noir to life means there's so much potential for this to be something genuinely fresh and unique. A true creative swing, use that word a lot here, that gives us a brand new take on Spider-Man. But as much as Sony was willing to greenlight the series, it's also Amazon we should be talking about. While I've had my problems with the studio at times, don't love the fact that they're gonna turn James Bond into content. Maybe they won't, I don't know. But regardless, when it comes to superheroes, Amazon has been making some of the most distinctive and progressive shows in the genre. Whether it's live action shows like The Boys or Gen V, or animated offerings like Invincible and Batman the Caped Crusader, Amazon has consistently made some of the best superhero projects in recent years and have shown a real willingness to experiment with the template of these types of stories to make shows that feel distinct. Weirdly, I think Batman Caped Crusader is an interesting comparison piece to Spider-Noir. Much like this series, Caped Crusader was a show Amazon acquired from Warner Brothers, one developed by an all-star creative team including Matt Reeves, J.J. Abrams, Ed Brubaker, and Bruce Timm. Instead of being yet another Batman cartoon, it took a new approach to adapting The Dark Knight as a 1940s period piece that celebrates Batman's Golden Age origins. Across its 10-episode debut season, Caped Crusader leans heavily into the pulp and noir roots of Batman's earliest comics, with everything from the show's visual style, character designs, and plots paying homage to this specific era of Batman and the media that inspired him. The fact that Amazon were happy to produce this show and allow its creators to fully lean into making a grim, moody 1930s detective show with Batman feels like a good sign for Spider-Noir. Even shows like Invincible and The Boys have succeeded because they're creator-driven, not studio-mandated programs micromanaged by executives throughout every stage of production. They're also really subversive. They're challenging the convention of what a superhero show can be. So, if the same is true of this, and Lord and Miller, Uziel, and Lightfoot are given the same creative freedom to interpret Spider-Man this way, we could actually have a really interesting series on the horizon, one that celebrates not just all things Spider-Man, but the pulp and noir roots of the superhero genre. Everything we've seen and heard about Spider-Noir so far seems to suggest this is the case. Circling back to that Esquire interview, because really it's the only thing we have that gives us a little bit more insight into the production, Uziel and Lightfoot spoke about wanting to make this a period-appropriate crime series that just so happens to feature Spider-Man. Sure, it might include the likes of Black Cat, the Sandman, and Silver Mane, but the showrunners aim to reimagine the Spider-Man world through the lens of a 1930s crime noir show. This even extends to the show's visual identity too. My initial hope was it would be entirely in black and white to really capture the tone and feel of its setting, but clearly that's not the case. Well, kind of. It's going to be released in two formats, black and white, designed to capture the sinister moral abyss of classic Raymond Chandler novels, and super saturated Technicolor, or I guess they're calling it True Hue? I can't even fucking say the word. True Hue, evoking the visual stylings of Dick Tracy and Will Eisner's The Spirit. This shows the clear understanding everyone involved has and the lengths they've gone to capture the look and feel of that period of time, just with a Spider-Man show. Judging from the first trailer, it seems like they've really nailed this approach. The entire thing feels quintessentially noir, with Dutch angles, split diopter shots, and the gritty aesthetic of Depression-era New York. Cage's Ben Reilly feels like the classic hard-boiled detective seen in films like The Maltese Falcon and Double Indemnity, but with an inherent zaniness of Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy or Sam Raimi's Darkman. I mean, speaking of that, Spider-Man on screen can't never really seem to escape the shadow of Sam Raimi. It's, gotta give the man his flowers there. It's a combination that cleverly blends the show's influences and promises to deliver a really unique take on Marvel's most iconic hero. Look, the show could release and be total garbage. It's possible. This is the studio that made Madam Web and the Emoji Movie, after all. And let's not pretend Amazon isn't known to drop a stinker or two. I mean, have you seen Citadel? Fuck me. But right now, I can't help but be out of my mind excited for Spider-Noir. Even if it doesn't turn out great, it's something different, it's distinct, and clearly born from a place of real passion by a team of people who've made some of the best superhero films in years, of all time even. It's projects like this in Spider-Verse that give me hope for the superhero genre, using these iconic, well-known characters for more than just cheap fan service and nostalgia, but to tell different, previously unimaginable stories and give us new perspectives on these pop culture icons. The fact that all of this emerged organically from casting Nicolas Cage in Spider-Verse just proves that the secret to building a good franchise isn't having superhuman foresights and planning skills or decades of meticulously mapped out phases, but simply good instincts and the willingness to improvise when the opportunity arises, and the willingness to take risks and try new things with these characters that have endured generations. If it doesn't work out, well, the classic Spider-Man is still there and just as popular as ever. No one is less excited for Brand New Day because Kraven or Madam Web didn't meet expectations. But if Spider-Noir is a hit, then you gain another excellent property that can live alongside the likes of Tom Holland's Peter Parker. So yeah, Spider-Noir looks fucking great, and I hope the show lives up to the promise delivered in this first trailer. It has the potential to be something so different and bold, and I honestly can't wait to see what the crew has cooked up for us when it swings onto Prime Video in May.